Hi, good day, everybody, and welcome to your Rouxbe live event. My name is Eric Weinkoop, and I'm the Director of Culinary Instruction here at Rouxbe, and I'm also one of your chef instructors in the courses. Today's topic is not just noodles, but it's oodles of noodles. And I want to thank you again for joining me today. For the next half an hour or so, I'd like to provide an introduction to this very broad and also very deep topic of food. And then we'll open up the space for some questions and answers and comments from all of you. As we get started, take a look at your screen. On the right-hand side, you should see a space, a small dialog box where you can type in any questions that you have, any comments as well. And I encourage, comments as well as questions. It's nice to create as much of a dialogue as we can in these sorts of events. But give me a little bit of time to introduce some information, and then we'll get to those uploaded questions and comments. Again, today's topic is the broad world of noodles. And, if we think about really any region, any country, any cuisine, any cultural group around the world, they feature some sort of what we might call a noodle. And, broadly speaking, then noodles even reach into areas such as dumplings and buns, both baked and steamed buns. And so if we think about this kind of a dough-based, paste-based world of cooking, it really is broad and very, very deep. And so consequently, we can't cover all of that space in just 30 or 60 minutes. So what I'm going to do is put together a two-part series. And so you'll see me again talking about some sort of noodles in about a month. But today we're going to carve out this space around Asia and Asian noodles. So still a very, very large part of the world in food cuisine or food culture and cuisine. But I want to get us thinking about some of the details here. Now, as we get started, keep in mind that the idea today is to get you thinking about noodles, cooking and perhaps eating more noodles, but really to get you motivated to get into the kitchen and have some fun around this topic. Okay, so with that, I'm going to be talking about a broader framework of vocabulary, of concepts, of handling techniques. With the goal that you can break out of the shackles of a recipe in the spirit of Rouxbe, right, as we focus on cooking methods and techniques and otherwise the broader framework of cooking that will instill confidence in you as you step into the kitchen each day. All right. So Asian noodles. Along with rice, noodles form, one cornerstone of staple foods for not just millions, but billions, right, of people in Asia. And consequently, it's, super important to food culture, right, in this part of the world. Noodles as a category tend to be, generally speaking, quick to make, noodle dishes, that is. And they are healthful. They certainly can be helpful, right, as we balance them with plenty of vegetables, for example, and flavorful, right? There are, any number of different condiments or flavor profiles that we can build to make our noodles taste good and interesting and reminiscent of some sort of cuisine that we're trying to replicate. Okay. So, where did the noodle originate, right? That's one of these hotly contested questions, by both food historians, food anthropologists, and armchair scholars as well. The nod often goes to Italy, right? And this fellow Marco Polo, who is said to have made some large trek across the Eurasian continent several hundred years ago. The finger is often pointed toward China, right, as the origin of noodles. And then some people even look toward the Middle East, right, as that point of origin. That's all hotly contested, and I'm not going to get into that at this point or ever, maybe. But what I can say with confidence is that through history and prehistory, foods have been invented or developed independently, right, in different places. And when it comes to noodles, I tend to embrace that approach, right, where I can recognize that perhaps Italy and China and the Middle East are all points of origin for noodles at some point in time, as original inventions. And along the way, there's certainly been plenty of cross pollination and a lot of movement, right, of people and know-how and food products along the Silk Road and other trade routes that have connected the Mediterranean basin with East Asia. And so, here we go. Let's recognize all these possibilities as we embrace the noodle. Now, when we take a look at Asia and this category of Asian noodles, we can say that many of the noodle varieties that we see in Japanese cuisine or Korean cuisine, for example, do have their origins in China, in the Asian mainland. And that's due to the reality that Chinese culture was so dominant, hundreds and even thousands of years ago. And yeah, I picture the tentacles of an octopus reaching out across these different regions of Asia, and the Chinese culture being deposited in these different areas, whether it be Vietnam or Japan, for example. So, we see food culture and fashion and agriculture and architecture and religion and linguistic influences coming from China. And no doubt noodles are in that mix as well. Now, the examples of noodles that we'll cover today are really representative of some mainstream varieties of noodles that we find across this entire region. And so consequently, as you go out to find these noodles in, let's say, an Asian supermarket or maybe a mainstream supermarket, you can go to just about any of these grocery stores and find a noodle that's suitable for some sort of a dish that you're making, regardless of the particular cuisine that it might originate in. So, in other words, you can, go to a Korean supermarket and find some noodles that would be suitable to make a Japanese noodle dish. Okay, again, the foundational points of these noodles are going to be common throughout this region. As we think about the variety that noodles provide us, right, in our daily and weekly cooking repertoire, shapes are one of the first things that come to mind. And, no doubt we're familiar with noodles that are short or long. Some of them are thick or thin in size. Others might have a curly or wavy texture, while some might be very smooth. And then, as we look up close at the cross section, we see that some are round or some are square, some are a little bit more flat in profile and thus rectangular in cross section. And all of these different physical features also lend a different experience on the palate. So in other words, it affects our flavor perception of that food as it then comes into contact with the ingredients and the mood that we're in, the lighting in the room, all these different things that affect the overall flavor experience. And so, do think about these size and shape aspects of noodles as well as other foods when we create a dish and a broader menu. Also, part of the versatility and the variability of noodle dishes are the cooking methods or handling techniques that we associate with noodles. And they really do run the gamut. We've got boiling, of course, I think we're all familiar with that. But also there's deep frying to create a crispy noodle. We also have pan frying or stir frying, which creates a certain effect. We might also soak noodles. I mean, sometimes noodles don't need cooking per se. They just need to be soaked in a lukewarm water to rehydrate to the point where we can eat them. And then we might also choose to steam noodles. And so again, there's a great variety of styles and mouth feels, and then also visual looks about a noodle dish that we can create based upon the cooking method or technique that we use to prepare it for consumption. Now, as we proceed through today's talk on noodles, I have organized the topics to correspond with primary ingredients that make up that noodle category. And so the ones that we'll touch upon include wheat and buckwheat. Now, buckwheat sounds like wheat, but it's unrelated. It's a gluten-free option for you. Also rice noodles from a broad category. And then we'll touch upon glass noodles, sometimes called cellophane noodles, which comprise examples such as mung bean noodles, sweet potato noodles or yams, and then also other tubers that might be used. And before we move on, I want to touch upon some other categories or types of noodles just to get you thinking about the broad possibility that lies in front of you. And one example is cornstarch. We don't often think about cornstarch as a basis for noodles, but one example is what I'll call a dessert noodle that goes into a preparation called faluda, which comes from the Middle East. It's very popularly consumed in India. And it's a beverage that has a scoop or two of ice cream in it and noodles. And so this is one place where we might see cornstarch used. Also sorghum and millet. We probably are familiar with those as grains, and or in their grain form, I should say. Sorghum and millet are commonly consumed in places like India and northern China. Often in their whole grain form, but it's also ground into flour and therefore made into many different dishes, including noodle preparations. And then another example is chickpea flour. And we can use other legumes as well, but chickpeas as an example. Chickpea flour is made into a dough and then extruded through a die and often deep fried. And then these very delicate, crunchy items are used as a garnish or otherwise as an internal ingredient in another dish. All right, so again, just to get you thinking about this wide variety of options that we have under this broad umbrella of noodles. Now, to jump into the first category, right, of primary ingredients, we have wheat. And, wheat was originally cultivated in the Middle East, some 12,000 or so years ago. But it didn't take a long time, relatively speaking, before noodles made their way east into Central Asia and into East Asia, into modern-day China. So as we think about Asian noodles and wheat noodles, we can trace the origin of many of these to northern China, where the wheat agriculture was based. Now, wheat noodles are broken into, broadly speaking, two subcategories. One category of noodle would be made of wheat flour combined with water and a pinch of salt. And then, we make a dough, roll that out, cut it, and you're good to go. The second category is based upon the same ingredients, but with the addition of eggs. And so here we have a category of egg noodles, which are also very closely related to Italian-style pastas, or many Italian-style pastas. And so, here, I want to point out the similarity, right, between these noodles from very different regions of the world that are really interchangeable at some level. It certainly can be interchangeable. So as we talk about breaking free of the shackles of recipes and really cooking according to a broader framework of understanding recipes and cooking methods and flavor profiles, for example, we can quickly see that an egg noodle from Italy could be used in an egg noodle preparation that might be of Asian origin, or vice versa. Okay, so think about the versatility that is introduced to your kitchen already. All right, wheat noodles are usually provided plain, but sometimes they're flavored, with things like crab, and then also things like vegetables, vegetable liquids, juices, right, or even sesame seeds. And I'll show you a couple of varieties of these very shortly. These are just kind of fun subcategories of noodles. And then, as we get started here, I'd like to make, a couple of comments around handling. These are some of the inside tips, right, to start to fine tune your handling of noodles and preparation of noodle dishes. And the first one is, right, as we look at noodles of different thicknesses. Some are very, very thin, capellini or angel hair pasta, sort of thin, or even thinner, right, in some cases. And then others are very thick, could be as thick as your finger, and somewhere in between. But, as we bring in other ingredients, such as vegetables, generally speaking, we want to try to match the thickness of the other ingredients with the thickness of the noodles. And so again, generally speaking, right, if you've got a thinner noodle, maybe we think about a julienne or fine julienne for the cut that we choose. And if we've got a thicker noodle, then a bâtonnet, right, or a relatively thicker cut would be quite acceptable. And so we're talking about mouthfeel, okay? And we're also thinking about the visual aesthetic of that dish when it's presented. So we're after some sort of a balance, okay, between these different components that go into this preparation. Now, as we drill down into this category of wheat-based noodles, we'll touch upon some specific examples of noodles. And let me preface this by saying that many of the terms that I will use will be from Japanese, okay? But do understand that a similar noodle exists in other parts of Asia. And so you'll find the equivalents in Korean or Chinese languages and in other language groups throughout Asia. So the first example would be so men. And let me take a quick tangent again by saying that this suffix that we see in noodle names, in this case the men, spelled M-E-N, means noodle. And we see equivalents in Chinese around main or mian or myong in Korean. And all of these suffixes refer to the noodle in its singular or plural form. So somen, again, is flour-based, a pretty simple construction, but it's very thin. It's within the Japanese context of noodles, it's perhaps the thinnest variety. This one traditionally is stretched and usually served with an accompanying dipping sauce. It could be warm or it could be cool, as a cool item. This would be a summertime, right, sort of a food. And occasionally you come across variations. And, one variation of somen that I will see once in a while is ume flavored somen. And so ume refers to the Japanese plum, sometimes called apricot. Some of you may know this in the context of a umeboshi, right, which is a pickled or sometimes dried and pickled plum that's got a fruity and tangy and salty sort of profile to it. So this sort of a puree would be kneaded into the dough. And what it lends really is a nice pink color for presentation. And we would then associate this with springtime. And so give us another month or two, and then we'll be in the middle of ume somen season. As I look out the window here in the Portland metro area here in Oregon, we just got a beautiful dusting of snow, at least a couple of inches or so here on the west side of town. So it's not quite springtime here, but I look forward to pink colored somen here pretty soon. I also want you to think about maybe contemporary service ideas around some of these noodles, as well as this idea of fusion, right? As we bring together elements of Asia with elements of Europe, for example, or other regions. And, a couple of ideas for somen, would be the idea of dressing somen noodles with a smooth, light tomato sauce. That goes very nicely. Also, it could be your favorite vinaigrette. You'd want to go light so that you don't create an oily dish, but a nice flavorful vinaigrette can dress up somen in the context of a Western preparation, a European preparation, very nicely as well. The next category of wheat noodle that I want to touch upon is ramen. And ramen is another noodle of Chinese origin. It is said to have come to Japan during the Meiji period, which was starting in about 1867. So we're talking about 151 years ago. And it's during that period of time that Japan welcomed even more so these foreign influences, including many food items. And so this quickly became a popular street food in Japan. And today it certainly is popular throughout the country. Here in the U.S., certainly in the big cities, we see the popularity of ramen in restaurants as well. I mean, ramen is eaten for lunch, for dinner, for a late night meal, as well as a snack in between meals in Japan. And you even see it served, early in the morning, 6:30, 7 o'clock, for example, is when I've had some of my most memorable bowls of ramen. And, usually these places are open, these shops are open to feed people that work at nighttime. And so, for example, the ramen shops that I've been to at this hour of the day have been very nearby fish markets. So, for example, the Tsukiji fish market in Tokyo, where you have folks that go out at night to fish. They return very early in the morning to present their catch. At their vending stalls, and so they're done with their day very early in the morning, and so it's probably dinner for them, but it sure looks like breakfast to me, which is quite fine in my book. Let's see, ramen. I've got some show and tell items here. So, ramen is found fresh. It's also commonly found dry, sometimes frozen. And I've got some variations here in flavor. This one has the incorporation of some taro root, so a tuber, a type of a potato. And when this cooks up, it takes on a little bit of a pinkish purplish sort of a hue, but still with kind of an earthy look to it. So kind of a fun product to play with. This one has a little bit of spinach juice incorporated into the dough. It's unfortunately brightened up with a little bit of food coloring as well, but you get the idea, right? We find these sorts of things in the European or Italian style pasta traditions as well. So we can do the same thing in Asia. And here's another cool one. This particular product is a type of ramen that has black sesame seeds ground and then folded into or kneaded into the dough. And, so this will give, as it's hydrated, just a little hint of sesame seed, in this case, black sesame seed. But otherwise, ramen noodles, in the Japanese context, consist of wheat and water, a little bit of salt, and then the addition of an alkaline water. And so we've got sodium carbonate or potassium carbonate that's added. And then that dough, once it's cooked, is going to have a more springy or chewy texture to it. It takes on a little bit of a yellow color as well. And in the absence of the alkaline component, sometimes eggs are added to the dough. And so then it becomes a variant, right? It becomes an egg noodle at that point. And so we see these some different types of noodles that are reminiscent of ramen, that are really related in this sort of a way. And we also see the fresh variety commonly referred to as yakisoba. And that's going to be a pan fried or a stir fried style of noodle. Another handling tip they want to share regarding a lot of these noodles, whether they're the wheat-based noodles or the buckwheat noodles that I'll touch upon next, is that you generally want to cook them in a lot of water. And this allows for a couple of things. One, for even cooking, but also it allows for the excess starches to be pulled away from the surface of the noodle. And then, what we often see, especially in restaurants and Japanese homes as well, is that these noodles will be rinsed under cold water after they're cooked in order to rinse off any excess starches that are still adhering to the surface of the noodle. And what that yields is a very nice, clean mouthfeel. Otherwise, what you would be left with is a little bit of tackiness or a little bit of stickiness, which is usually considered undesirable in this context of cooking. Now, very different from some of the, say, Italian pasta approaches to noodle handling, where we might want to maintain some of that tackiness in order to grab onto the sauce, the heavier sauce that would be paired with that noodle. Okay, so some aesthetic differences, right, as we look at different regional food cultures. Let's see, the next category I want to look at here is called udon. And udon is going to be a thicker noodle in the Japanese context. Historically, this comes from China again. It's said to have come to China into the southern island of Shikoku, and about 1,000 years ago or more. And like much of the Japanese uptake of Chinese culture, a lot of the early influences came in through southern or southwestern Japan, which is geographically much closer to the Chinese mainland. And so udon was one of those early imports. So this also comes in a dried form. You can find it frozen or fresh as well. Udon is probably most commonly served in the form of a noodle broth bowl, much like ramen is. Although, we do see it in a yaki udon or a stir-fried or pan-fried version. In fact, those of you that are in the Rouxbe Forks Over Knives course or the professional plant-based course, you have come across this recipe already, where you're making the udon dough, preparing the noodles, and then finishing it, either as a stir-fried version or a version in broth. And so this is going to be reminiscent of that. One of the things that to keep in mind is that all of these noodles and maybe especially udon comes in various thicknesses and different styles depending on the region. And so as we, for example, go to a website or we go to a restaurant and we encounter a bowl of udon or a bowl of ramen, keep in mind that that's usually representative of just one variety. And, especially if we are eating these items outside of Japan, we often just see one or two or three varieties out of the dozens or even hundreds of varieties that we could possibly encounter, as we travel through the regions of Japan in this case, not to mention the broader Asia, right, as we consider these wider wheat-based noodles in other regions as well. All right. So, other styles of udon, aside from the traditional soy sauce-based broth, right, would be curry udon or kare udon, where we have a broth that is flavored with curry spices. We also, might see a spicy, garlicky, kind of a miso-based flavor profile called jajamen. So there's a lot of these variations that certainly are not mainstreamed outside the U.S., but open up this larger possibility of flavor profiles for us as we use our own creativity in the kitchen, right, to improvise and to make something exciting and flavorful for our own families. The next category is buckwheat. Buckwheat is, again, not wheat. It's going to be just another grain. Some of you might know it as kasha. It is grown in northern China, across Russia, and in the north and northeast regions of Japan, in Tohoku and Hokkaido. And buckwheat is, or soba, is certainly eaten in the groat form, but at least in the Japanese context, it's ground into a flour and made into noodles very frequently. And here is an example, right, of soba. You can see that they are, relatively thin. And, I'm a big fan of soba because they have a very a deep, nutty, earthy flavor and a nice chew, a very nice texture to them. And, this too is going to be cooked in water, right? Just straight unsalted water. And then traditionally paired with a dipping sauce, either hot or cold. And then also you might find it served in a bowl with a broth in a noodle bowl, sort of a tradition. Soba dates to the Edo period. So about 400 or so years ago in Japan is when this became popularized. And it was originally associated with priests, with laborers, and with the lower classes in terms of consumption. And this runs along the lines of the color of food, right? Where white, refined foods, whether this is in Europe or in Asia, were associated with the upper classes. And then the unrefined foods were associated with the lower classes. And so hence, at least very early on, soba had that sort of an association. That's far from the truth today, where, we see fine dining restaurants that are built around a soba-focused menu. This is another variation of soba that we might come across. And this is called cha soba. Cha means tea. And so this particular type of soba is made by kneading matcha, right, or ground whole tea leaves, into the dough. And if you take a smell of this, it's beautiful. It smells of matcha. Once it's cooked up, that aroma is activated even more, so we can get the flavor and enjoy that, as we're having noodles. And again, I share these other variations with you, number one, so that you know that they're out there, but also to encourage you, when you're making your own noodles, to try different things, right? Maybe you're going to be bringing in the flavor of Earl Grey tea, right? Or tomato puree or something else when you're making even something like soba, right? So again, be creative, have some fun with it, and exercise your creative license. A traditional accompaniment to soba, while it is served, in its dipping sauce sort of a presentation format, is tempura. And tempura is very basically a battered and or breaded and deep fried something. And often it's going to be a vegetable, it's going to be seafood in some way, but it could really be almost anything. I've had tempura bananas and different things at Japanese restaurants. So it's all real. And anyway, these sort of things are a very nice crunchy accompaniment to an otherwise wet and kind of a soft presentation, the way of noodles with their broth. Another thing that I'll mention here in terms of the soba is that at New Year's time, they are an important symbolic food. And they're eaten, either on Christmas Eve or it could be Christmas Day, depending on the region or the household tradition. But soba represents long life. And some of the soba noodles are actually quite long, much longer than the example that I have here in front of me. And the idea of the symbolism is that, as you eat the soba and you cross over or have made the transition into the new year, that the noodle is going to carry you through the entirety of the new year, right? And so you'll have good health after eating the soba. And so some fun, again, food symbolism and food traditions, right, that go along with these specific items at certain times of the year. The next category that I want to touch upon is the rice noodle. Rice noodles are just a broad category of noodles. Originally, these would have come out of areas in southern China, right? So if wheat is associated with northern China, then rice and the rice growing regions are associated with southern China. So hence the rice noodles tend to come out of southern China and then areas of Southeast Asia as well. And so think about Thailand and Vietnam and other regions as well. As we take a look at various rice noodles, okay, so I have an example of rice vermicelli. And as you can see, these are very, very thin, not a whole lot more than the thickness of your hair, if you have coarse hair, that is. And this is very nice in soup, right? It has a very delicate sort of a texture to it. Here is an example of kind of a medium thickness dried rice noodle. And this is an example of a thicker product. And we start to associate these with some of the iconic dishes of Vietnam, such as pho, right? The noodle soup preparation. As well as pad thai, right? The stir-fried or pan-fried noodle preparation from Thailand. And, these do nicely in soups as well as stir-fried preparations. But again, these are very simply based upon rice and water. Okay. And then the last category that I want to touch upon today is this category of glass noodles, sometimes called cellophane noodles. And these are going to be based upon mung bean starch or sweet potato starch, and then sometimes other tuber starches as well, such as cassava and other things, depending on what region you find yourself in. Okay, and let me pull up an example here. So this is what's sometimes referred to as a bean thread. This is what just came out of the package here. So you can see that it's kind of thin in consistency, but very white. And so, this sort of a thing is going to become translucent once it's cooked. So it moves from opaque to translucent, hence the name glass noodle. All right. And so these sort of noodles are consumed throughout Asia. So not just in Japan, but Korea, Taiwan, in China, and throughout the region. This is another example, and this is a Korean noodle, and this is based upon sweet potato starch. And this would go into a dish called japchae, for example, which is a kind of I'll call it a simmered vegetable and meat dish traditionally. And these particular noodles, this category of noodle is going to be more toothsome, a little bit more chewy than rice noodles, for example. So a little bit different texture. This particular noodle is going to be, noticeably thicker than the bean thread example. And so this one will take a little bit of simmering, with a flavorful liquid in order to draw in some additional flavors. It's otherwise a relatively bland sort of a noodle, but gives just fantastic texture to the dish that you might be producing. Okay, and then a similar item. This is also a Korean counterpart here. This one happens to be flavored with celery extract. And so if you take a deep whiff, you can pick up that clean vegetal smell of celery. This is really exciting, right? All these variations of noodles. I'll go ahead and put these down now. Again, I want to share these with you, with the idea of, again, inspiring you to look beyond just the plain old noodle and think about these different flavor infusions and consider making them yourself as well. The last comment before I'll shift to the Q&A is this notion of cross-cultural service ideas. And here I want to consider the noodle from the perspective of the Italian pasta, and throw out a couple of ideas. For example, if you've got something like capellini, right, or angel hair pasta, or even spaghettini, you might consider tossing this with a nice, robust flavored tomato sauce, and then garnishing it with a chiffonade of shiso. Shiso is an herb that's common in Korea and Japan. In this case, I'm thinking about the green variety rather than the red variety. Shiso is related to mint and basil, so it has those sort of qualities, kind of a refreshing sort of a quality to it, and it goes very well with the tomato sauce. And so we can bring in these elements of East Asia, with traditional European or Italian sorts of preparations. And then, also you might choose another long pasta. It could be a spaghetti or a fettuccine. And, in the spirit of an oil and garlic preparation, right, you might just do that. Or it could be tossing that noodle with your favorite vinaigrette and then garnishing it generously with wakame. And wakame is one of the many sea grasses, or, we might call it seaweed, that's consumed in Japan, except wakame it's a little bit thinner, a little bit more delicate in texture, and it eats very nicely as a salad green of sorts. At least that's one way that I think of it. And so to pair it with some pasta actually goes very, very well. And so you might give that a try tonight, even, right, as you prepare pasta, hopefully from your motivation here with this particular talk. So at this point, what I'll do is transition to the Q&A and respond to what we've got going here. And I see a nice list of things. And let me draw these up here. And so Lena says, can you talk about the nutritional value of different types of noodles? I'll just generally say, right, that if we think about some of the more refined flours that go into noodles, such as white rice, then we have relatively less nutritional value than, say, some of the whole grain varieties of noodles, right? Whether it's a soba, using the whole buckwheat, which contains a lot of micronutrients, a lot of minerals, or just simply a whole wheat variety of pasta. So there's going to be a large spread potentially, right, in the nutritional value provided by noodles. But one thing that I always like to mention is that we want to otherwise consume a varied diet, right? So if we happen to be eating rice noodles, which are pretty white and lacking of the bran and all the goodness that comes along with that outer layer, we've got vegetables and we've got other sources of protein, for example, that would accompany that meal. All right. Next up from CL. I enjoy healthy noodle dishes, especially with a lot of vegetables. What types of noodles are best to use in a dish when you want to freeze and reheat later? Any noodles you should specifically avoid for this purpose? Let me start out with some of the more delicate noodles in my experience, and those would be rice noodles. They often get a little bit brittle once they come out of the freezer and thaw. But, other noodles that do well are egg noodles. And so any of these, whether they're Italian style or Asian style noodles that have the extra moisture and structure provided by eggs can freeze, very nicely. Next up from Penny, will you talk about gluten-free noodles? So I touched upon buckwheat, right, as a pretty commonly available variety, although you would want to look for 100% buckwheat noodles because most of them are going to be blended with wheat flour at about 10 to 20%. But there are some gluten-free options for you. And then, we can take a look at things like cornstarch or chickpeas, even other legume pastes. That I mentioned earlier on in this talk. Some of those noodles aren't necessarily long, like spaghetti long noodles, but shorter and end up being used in different styles of preparations. And then today, of course, we have the availability to access gluten-free flour blends, which can help us along this path of making gluten-free noodles. And, one place to source that sort of thing would be Bob's Red Mill. Bob's produces a few different gluten-free blends for some different applications. And, one of them is, labeled pizza dough gluten-free flour blend. And something like that is going to have the structure to make some noodles as well, probably some hand-cut noodles if that's what you're thinking. All right, let's see. Next is from Keela. Regarding rinsing cooked noodles, is that generally for cold dishes? Are there warm served dishes where rinsed noodles are used? And if so, are they then reheated in the sauce or some other way? So on one hand, if you're cooking the noodles in a generous amount of water, then again, that may be adequate to draw away those excess starches. But there are times when they might be, when hot noodles or noodles to be served hot may be rinsed and then very quickly dunked in hot water to reheat them before they're combined with the hot broth and other ingredients. Okay, so at home, that sort of handling can become a little tedious because of the multiple steps. But we sometimes see that in restaurant settings. Let's see, next we've got a comment from CL, a question from CL. Do you have a written resource we can reference with this great information you're sharing about types and usages of different noodles? Let's see, CL. I've got some handwritten notes here, but otherwise, perhaps you can watch the archived version of this live event at your leisure, and then even take notes. And I don't mean to put too much of a student-like burden on you, but you might come away remembering a lot of information that way. Let's see. Lena says, for a whole food plant-based diet, are there any are there any noodles we need to stay away from? Let's see. My quick answer would be no. However, as we start to look at the nuances of dietary preference, right? You might choose to stay away from some of the more highly refined noodles, such as white rice based noodles. But generally speaking, for a plant-based diet, noodles, again, except for egg noodles, right, would be quite fine. Farine says, what are the best noodles to use for oil-free cooking? For oil-free cooking, let's see, most, let me see. Yeah, generally speaking, the noodles can be workable here, depending on the type of dish you're producing. So, for example, if you're going to put noodles into, say, a soup, then it's going to be pretty easy to work with. If you're thinking about a pan-fried or stir-fried noodle dish, then that becomes a little bit more challenging. Rice noodles have a tendency to stick to the pan pretty easily. So you might lean toward a wheat flour based noodle or even a buckwheat noodle, which has a little bit more structure to it. If you want to try something in the pan fry, stir fry category without oil. And then here too, you want to either use a non-stick pan or consider a pan that is nicely seasoned, right, in the category of a high carbon steel wok or a cast iron pan. All right, next up from Farine again is, as new vegans, I'm introducing my kids to new flavors. I'd like to try cow sui. What noodles work? So, in this category, we're using these medium thickness, so kind of a ramen, sort of a thickness noodle. And, these, I believe, are often egg noodles. And so, if you go to the grocery store and look at really any number of egg noodles that fall into, although if you're talking about vegan noodles here, then certainly just reach for a ramen-like noodle that's solely based upon flour, water, and salt, and but typically in a medium thickness. And again, I encourage flexibility, okay, in the choice of your noodles so that you don't get so bound by a recipe, but experience the freedom, right, of a broader framework. You might pick up a couple, 3 different noodles and see what texture that you and your children like the best. As I mentioned earlier in the talk, much of the enjoyment comes from the size of the noodle on the palate, and so that can very much be a personal preference. Let's see. Bobby asks, other than flavor, what purpose does salt serve in the noodle? Flavor, that little edge of seasoning is going to be the main thing that comes to mind in terms of the usual salt that is added. It can certainly be omitted. I don't think that's going to be a problem. And you can figure out how you want to tailor the noodle to suit your palate from there, based upon the other ingredients and seasonings that you might add to the finished dish. Let's see. Can you use egg replacer in making noodles? Asked Patsy. My quick response would be, yeah, probably. Although I got to admit that I've never actually made noodles with a noodle replacer. So I'd have to do a little bit of recipe testing myself to really understand textural or structural differences that might result from that. But I always say, hey, why not? Give it a try. And then, we're going to know a little bit more. So if you don't get to it first, then I will, Patsy, and I'll try to pass on that information to you. What's the shelf life of noodles? Fresh noodles, if you come across fresh noodles, I recommend that you try to use them up within a couple, 3 days. They start to discolor. Fresh noodles, meaning noodles that you buy from the store, if they don't have preservatives in them. Many of them have a preservative added, in which case they're going to last for several days. But if you're making noodles at home, fresh pasta, for example, it'll start to darken. Very often, little dark speckles start to develop in the dough, after a couple, 3-ish days. It's usually edible or still for another couple, 3 days, but it might not be as visually appealing. If you're talking about just leftover dry noodles, I find that they can hang around for 4, 5, 6 days pretty easily, depending on how your temperature of your refrigerator is set. But as any sort of a leftover food goes, as you start to approach day 6 and day 7 in the refrigerator, use all of your senses to start to detect for spoilage. Slimy textures on the fingers. We start to get sometimes at some point aroma, and then also flavor. And sometimes discoloration, and those things come in different sequences and in different packages, different pairings. So use all of your senses. I've always told my students, right, when in doubt, put it in your mouth and just figure out what's going on with the food. And if the food is starting to turn the corner a little bit, and you happen to eat a little bit of it, it's not going to kill you. If anything, it might just gross you out, but it's probably not going to kill you. And I can just about vouch that, that's not going to kill you. But you're going to learn a lot more about the food in terms of the subtleties of spoilage that start to set in. When would you choose fresh pasta over dried? Asked Becky. It's a personal preference. I always throw that out first. Sometimes it's going to be convenience, right? If you've got a place to store, a cool place to store fresh pasta, then you might give that a try. Fresh pasta also cooks very, very quickly. Most of it probably within 1 to maybe 3 minutes or so, even for the thicker types of fresh noodle varieties. So those are some considerations, right? Cooking time, as well as your storage situation, and then just personal preference. Some people, get down to, some nuances around the finished product, but again, all that becomes a personal aesthetic preference for you. Best way to keep rice noodles from sticking together once cooked and keeping them hot. Thanks, says David. Let's see. So best way to keep them from sticking together. you got a couple of options. One is to apply a little bit of oil to minimize the sticking. It's not a 100% cure unless you're adding lots of oil, which I don't usually recommend. The next thing is to refresh the noodles in some water to loosen them up. And depending on how you're serving them, that could be cool water or could be hot water. And if you want to rewarm or reheat the noodles, then a quick dunk in some hot water will do the trick. Now, if you know that you're going to make the noodles ahead of time and you'll be dunking them in hot water, then what you might consider doing is cooking the rice noodle just a little bit shy, right, of full doneness, so that subsequent dunk in hot water will then take it to its proper degree of doneness without overcooking it. All right, so there's a little bit of a nuance in temperature and time control, but if you can work with that, then your cooking overall is going to benefit as you learn these more delicate skills around food handling. Are the rice noodles white rice noodles? Asks Leslie. And all the examples that I have in front of me are, and the ones that I'm familiar with have been. Sometimes they are sweet rice or sticky rice flour, and sometimes they're just regular rice, well, I'll say non-sticky rice varieties of flour. But they do tend to be white rice. That's not to say, right, that you couldn't use a whole grain rice flour and make noodles from that. What are good quick cooking and healthy noodles to include in dishes when time is short? Wow, again, so many of these noodles are pretty quick cooking, so it might just be a matter of selecting a whole grain variety of noodles, so you get more of the context, right, of the noodle. So you got the micronutrients that'll come along with that. And then, so buckwheat is an example, and any of the whole wheat Italian style pastas on the market would be good options for that. And then, also you might think about batch cooking, right? This is one of those situations where to cook pasta ahead of time, maybe 2 or 3 days worth, 4 days worth of pasta would be safe before you have any concerns, right, of spoilage setting in. And then, you've got either pasta ready to eat at that point in a cool form, or you can dunk it into hot water to warm it up, or you can steam it very, very quickly, or drop it into a pan for, a quick stir-fry dish. And so those would be the methods that I use at home. Next up, would you describe in more detail how to pan fry noodles? Asks Rose. So, typically there's going to be some degree of oil, okay, that's going to be used. I would recommend getting your vegetables in the pan first and cooking them to, just about full doneness. For those of you out there that might include animal proteins in your diet, you'd want to get these cooked very often first, and then we remove them from the pan, and then you can bring your cooked noodles into the pan with any of the other sauce components, and then toss to finish. And so what you're doing essentially at that point is just heating up the noodles that were pre-cooked, and then bringing them together with all the other cooked components of that final dish. By the way, I'm a runner. Which noodles are best to eat to give me the energy that I need to run? This is from Haley. And, generally speaking, right, if we're talking about this idea of carb loading, right, most any noodle would do, right, because they're going to be a great source of carbohydrates, as a staple food is concerned. And so really I would reach to, whatever noodle, texturally and flavor wise is most interesting to you, Haley. Is it practical to make starch type noodles at home, like mung bean threads? Says Alan. My quick answer is yes. When we look at some of these starch rather than kneaded dough, right? Sort of noodles, some sort of an extruding tool becomes necessary. And if you go to an Indian grocery store, you are very likely to find some sort of a simple tool that will extrude noodles. And then you can put in any kind of a dough that you want. It could be a starch-based, like a mung bean starch-based dough, or a legume-based dough to get the job done. Let's see. Next up, I cook for cruises often and serve food from a bain-marie topside. Any suggestions for keeping scratch-made or purchased cooked noodles warm, yet avoiding overcooking? Wow. Okay, that's a challenge. So this would go for rice too, as I frequently am asked to provide Asian selections. Okay, this is from Wanda. So Wanda, one thing that comes to mind, right, is this Korean noodle, right, based upon the sweet potato starch. And remember, we had the beautiful celery extract version as well. But this particular noodle holds up very well. And this would be probably my first go-to in a situation where I had to hold noodles for a relatively long period of time. So give that a try, and then from there you might check out some of these other cellophane or glass noodles. And so even these bean thread noodles, they do pretty well holding for a longer service time. Okay, so think cellophane or glass noodle category. And let's see, you asked about rice as well. Here, I would point you generally to pilaf preparations. Pilaf preparations have some oil traditionally involved, where we risole or we coat the individual grain in oil, and then we proceed with the cooking. And then, we're able to hold that product. It's got some nice, flavors and aromas from the other ingredients, often whole spices that we might use. But, that tends to have a fairly stable shelf life, as far as a service period is concerned. You might also consider something like biryani, right? A traditional Indian rice preparation, which can be done in many different styles, vegetarian versions as well as meat and seafood versions. And, those tend to hang around during service period very nicely as well. Let's see, next up, I'm exploring other grains for pasta. Is there anything I should know to adjust recipes when using, for example, rice flour? So sweet rice flour, brown rice, white rice, quinoa corn, sago palm starch, and making my own noodles. This also comes from Wanda. Let's see here. There's potentially a lot of nuances, right, that are going to make the difference between the handling of these different grains or grain flours for pasta. My quick answer, Wanda, really is to visit your local library and kind of have these sort of resources at hand as you kind of go down your list and check off your list of these different types of noodles that you might use. Keep in mind also, some of these, it kind of depends on what we're talking about here, but some of these products, if you're making the noodles yourself, right? For example, rice flour, we'll often cook the rice flour first, and then we will, extrude or roll out the dough in some fashion, and then we can dry it, and then we can keep it, and such that when we go to cook with it, the cooking time is very short, or sometimes it requires soaking, right, for some rehydration. This is one of those examples where soaking might be adequate. But you run up against these sorts of nuances, such that I think it goes beyond the limited time scope that I have here. But take a look at some of the wonderful books on noodles that are at your public library. What are noodles used in pad thai? Asks Alan. So we've got a couple of varieties here, right? These rice stick, they're called, and these are, they come in some different thicknesses, right? But they're going to be made from rice and water most of the time. So a very simple sort of a noodle. But rice stick is what you would look for. Joanne says, learned a lot. Thanks. Thank you very much, Joanne, for the feedback. I appreciate it. And, hope that you've been inspired to cook with noodles at home here as soon as dinner tonight. Squid ink pasta isn't solely plant-based. That's true. Along with the category of egg noodles, right? We definitely have a lot of noodles that are not solely plant-based. And, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, you'll come across especially wheat noodles that might be flavored with shrimp or crab. And that's going to be in the Asian context, right? So such that, we do have just a beautiful variation of noodles to choose from. Arguably, most of them are plant-based, but many of them still are not. Regarding noodle shapes cut from vegetables, such as zucchini, carrots, and sweet potatoes, should these be only for immediate serving, or is there a way to preserve flavor, quality, and visual appeal while keeping warm? Other vegetables that hold up well, asks Wanda. Well, so we're getting into zoodles and other plant-based noodles. Wow. If you're talking about hot preparations for these things, that's going to be a real challenge, Wanda, because as soon as we start to apply heat, and certainly the heat that would be required to hold these things in the context of service, such as 145 degrees Fahrenheit, then there's going to be a continuous but slow breakdown of the vegetable fibers, right? Which means that you're going to end up with just very, very soft and lifeless noodles and zoodles when it's all said and done here. On the other hand, if you will make a chilled or a room temperature, say a raw salad sort of a preparation, then they will hold up much nicer. However, once you start to incorporate acids, usually in the vinaigrette or in the sauce in some way, that will also start to soften the structure of the salad. So even there, your shelf life is going to be limited, but arguably longer than if you were to heat or to cook the vegetable-based noodles. Let's see. I'm going to take a look at what method is used to cook glass noodles. This is from Sally. So for the glass noodles, and I'm going to use this example here of these Korean noodles that I referenced a couple of times that can go into soups or a classic dish called japchae. And here, I recommend that you soak the noodles. You might soak them for a good 20 or 30 minutes. In order to get an initial hydration and softening of the noodles. And then, they would go into the second stage simmer. And it's going to be at that point that the simmering liquid is going to be a very flavorful sort of a liquid that's going to certainly evaporate a bit during cooking, but also be further absorbed by the noodle. These noodles otherwise are fairly bland, and so they benefit from that flavoring and seasoning that comes from that secondary simmering step. Let's see here. We've got Leslie that says, thank you, Chef. Again, thank you very much for your feedback. I appreciate it very much, and good to know that you're enjoying the topic. Hi, Chef Eric. Oh, hey, I recognize it there. The ume somen sounds beautiful and refreshing. Do you happen to know where this can be found? or a recipe to make it. Hey, Adair, I don't have a recipe offhand, but I think I saw, in fact, yeah, I'm sure that I saw the ume somen yesterday at Uajimaya in Beaverton, where I was out shopping yesterday for these show and tell items. And I forget the aisle number, but you'll see it at Uajimaya. Looking forward to crossing cultures with noodles. Thank you for the suggestion. Strangely, I never thought of doing that, says Adair. Um, you know, uh, I'm glad this got you thinking more about this aspect of combining flavors and ingredients from different regions, because it really does open a new door to cooking. Think about Latin America, right? Think about Northern Africa and so many other regions where we identify the cuisines as standalone cuisines, but just start to bring them together with other regions and find these intersections that really work in terms of flavor and textures that make sense. Next, from Angelique. Is there a big difference between typical ramen packs and higher end ramen sold in Asian grocers? Angelique, thank you so much for asking this question. And so what I'm picturing here are these products at a grocery store, right on a shelf. And my quick answer is yes, there is, right? If we look at some of the less expensive items, like these top ramen sort of products that are kind of the traditional mainstay of American college students at 10 cents a pack sort of a thing, compared to some of these items that might be $3 a pack. You get a different textural quality in the noodles. And, I would bet that if we read the ingredient list, we would probably see a shorter ingredient list, with some of these higher end instant types of ramens that are sold in the grocery stores. And, not to mention some of the additional flavor interest and variation that we get, with these specialized and often more expensive products. And so again, yes, I think we can identify some sort of quality differences across this array of instant ramen products. Next up from Kila, could you spell some of the Asian names, in particular the shiso, Korean, oh, wow, okay. You've introduced some Hangul to me, and I don't read Hangul, sorry. Let's see. Perhaps we can follow up with this, Kila, and I can drill down more specifically to some of the terminology that you're after. I'd be happy to share whatever I can with you. Okay, shoot me an email, all right, at eric@rouxbe.com, and then we can connect on this. Any noodles native to North America, North American early inhabitants, asks Jesse. Wow. I'll tell you that I am unfamiliar with noodles that originate in North America. Now, let's see. It's not too much of a stretch, right, to get into things like flatbreads, right, from these base doughs. And as far as North America is concerned, right, North America is home to the tortilla. And let's see, I can give me a few minutes. I probably come up with something that we can certainly create today. But as far as a historical perspective goes, I'm not coming up with anything in the way of noodles specifically that are native to North America. But it's kiss and cousin, right? Flatbreads, i.e., tortillas, and other I think such variants. Those are going to be in abundance. Is it practical to make starch-based noodles at home? In some cases, yes, Alan, right? As I think I touched upon earlier, you might need some specialized equipment, in terms of an extruding tool, unless you want to make some of the the flat, large noodles, kind of like the spring roll wrapper style preparations, where we would create a thin paste, and then we would flatten that paste out like a crepe, very, very thin, and then allow that to dry. And then that can be reconstituted or rehydrated, and then used as a large format noodle, kind of in a flat orientation. Let's see. Delalo lasagna noodles contain whole wheat semolina. Is this considered a refined product or not? I'm whole food plant-based. Thanks, says Kim. So let me talk just a little bit about the way we approach a whole food plant-based diet relative to what I'm going to call refined foods versus processed foods. All right, so those are a couple of terms that sometimes overlap, and sometimes they are quite different in their meaning. In this case, if we're talking about whole wheat semolina, we're talking about fundamentally a whole food product, right? But it's so in that sense, it's not refined, right? Where constituents are removed, such as bran. In this case, we're talking about, however, a processed food, right? Where we have the whole grain that is then ground or processed into a different form. And, I maybe wouldn't say that it's refined, but processed, right? If that makes sense. So, these sorts of foods exist on a spectrum. And if you think about refined foods as being not so good, right? And processed foods still possibly having micronutrients and other, whole food constituents intact, we can envision a spectrum of food here. So, my quick response here to the whole wheat semolina pasta is that it's probably, quite fine, right? You're getting that context of the whole food coming through. Lise asks, cooking noodles in a homemade chicken stock. What do you think? I think that sounds delicious. In fact, we just had something like that in the last couple of days here at home, utilizing some of this rice vermicelli. Anjali, my wife, made a very nice soup, and Ayush, our little guy here, enjoyed that for lunch. Thank you, Chef, says Keela. Thank you very much. I hope we can connect right on the vocabulary. I'm happy to continue that discussion. Thanks, Eric. Interesting talk, says Alan. Thank you very much. I appreciate your participation today. And thank you, says Susan. Thank you very much. I appreciate your attendance today and your interest in noodles. And let's continue this discussion next month as we look at part 2 under this broader umbrella of noodles. And so this brings me to the end of the Q&A list. And once again, thank you all individually for taking time out today to join me in this beautiful quest down Noodle Lane. And I'll see you again very soon here at Rouxbe. Thank you very much. Bye now.